The morning the loan officer called by 40 acres worthless. It was the second Tuesday of March 1994, and the sky was the color of old tin, the kind of low gray that doesn't rain and doesn't clear. Just sits over the ridge like it's thinking. I remember the cold came in under the door of the kitchen, and my coffee went lukewarm while I stood there with the phone against my ear, listening to a young man read me a number off a page he'd never walked. He called the place North Ridge, which was the name my grandfather gave it, and he called it dry, which was the word the whole county had been using for that ground longer than I'd been alive. I was 58 years old that spring, and I had spent most of those years learning that the men who name a thing are rarely the men who know it. He told me the appraisal came back at $400 an acre, which was less than half what the bottom land down by the river was fetching, and he told me it was because there was no water. No? Well, that held. No creek that ran past June. He said the words with a kind of gentle certainty, the way a man says something he has never once doubted, and I thanked him, and hung up and stood there with the cold coming under the door. I want to be honest about my reasons for what came after, because it would be easy to make myself out as a man of great faith, and I wasn't. I was a man with 31 head of cattle. A mortgage, the bank now said, was secured by dirt, and a notebook I hadn't opened in 11 years. My grandfather had bought that 40 in 1931. At the bottom of everything, when land was cheap because men were desperate, and he'd paid $8 an acre for ground that 3 previous owners had walked away from. People said he was a fool for it then too. He was not a fool. He was the most patient man I ever knew. And he used to tell me, when I was a boy, riding on the fender of his tractor, that you can't drink the opinion of a man who's never dug. I didn't understand it then. I thought it was just something old men said to fill the quiet. It took me 60 years to understand he was handing me a tool, and I'd left it in the drawer. The reason the county called North Ridge dry was not a lie, exactly. It was a story that had been true long enough that nobody bothered to check whether it was still true. And that is a different and more dangerous thing than a lie. The story went that the ridge sat on shale, hard gray shale, that came up close to the surface in the north pasture, where you could see it breaking through the grass like the backs of buried animals. And that shale meant no water, and no water meant no worth. 3 wells had been drilled up there across the decades. The first, my grandfather's own, back in 1938, went down to 40 feet and came up dry, and he capped it and never spoke of it that I heard. The second was drilled by a man named to a neighbor's account in 1961, 60 feet dry, and he sold out and moved to town within the year. The third was 1979, my own doing, when I was younger and had money from a good beef year and thought I could buy my way out of hauling water. I hired a rig out of the county seat, a big rotary thing that chewed up the pasture and cost me $900 I didn't have to spare, and it went down 55 feet and hit that shale, and the driller shook his head and said there was nothing under it worth chasing. 55 feet. I remember the number because I paid for every foot of it. So when the loan officer said dry, he was only saying what 3 holes and 60 years had already said, and I couldn't rightly argue with him, standing in my kitchen with a lukewarm cup. What I could do, though, what I finally did, was go out to the barn. The barn on North Ridge is the oldest building I own, older than the house, built by my grandfather's own hands in the year he bought the place, and it has that smell old barns have, of dust and dry hay and machine oil and the ghost of every animal that ever stood in it. I went out there the afternoon of that same Tuesday, after the loan officer's number had sat in me long enough to turn from insult into something else, something more like a question. There was a workbench along the north wall, and under it a wooden crate my grandfather had built to hold his ledgers, and in that crate, wrapped in a feed sack gone soft as cloth, was the notebook. Marbled cover, black and white, the corners rubbed round and soft, the kind of composition book they sold at the mercantile for a nickel. I'd found it the week after we buried him in 1983 and I'd read a few pages and put it back because I wasn't ready. Grief does that. It makes you set down the very thing that would help you, because picking it up means the man is really gone and everything in his hand is all you'll ever get. 11 years I left it there. I'll own that. I am a man who postpones the important thing, and I have paid for that habit more than once. That Tuesday I carried the notebook back to the house under my coat, like it was something alive, and I sat at the kitchen table under the single bulb that hangs over it, and I opened it, and I started to read the careful pencil that had gone brown with time. Most of it was what you'd expect. Rainfall figures, calving dates, the price of feed corn in 1936, a list of fence posts set and the day he set them. My grandfather wrote the way he farmed. Slow and complete. Nothing wasted. Everything accounted for. And then, about 2/3 of the way through, on a page dated the fall of 1938, the fall after his own well came up dry, I found the line that changed everything, though I didn't know it yet, and I read it 3 times before I understood I was even looking at it. The line was this, and I have it before me now, as I tell you, so I get it right. He wrote in that brown pencil, well, quit at 40. Shale hard. But cows won't leave the north. Draw in drought. He underlined the last part. And then, below it, smaller, like a thought he'd had walking away, he wrote, water below the shale. And he circled that little question mark, circled it twice and never answered it, because the next entry was about a heifer that had gone down with milk fever, and the one after that was about the first frost, and a man's life runs on like that. One urgent thing crowding out the important one, and the question sat there in his notebook for 56 years waiting for somebody to be still enough to read it. I sat there under that bulb a long time. I thought about the north draw, that low fold of ground where the ridge dips before it climbs again, where the grass stays green 2 weeks longer than anywhere else on the place. Where I had noticed, without ever letting myself notice, that my cattle bunched up in the worst of every August. I had thought it was the shade from the old hedgerow. I had thought it was the wind out of that hollow. I had never once thought it was because they knew something the drilling rig didn't. My grandfather had watched those cows in the drought of 1936, watched them refuse to leave a patch of ground that by every account should have been the driest on the farm, and he had written down the observation, and then written down the question, and the question was the whole thing. Water below the shale. Every well ever drilled on Northridge had stopped when it hit that gray rock. Because everybody, my grandfather included in 1938, everybody who ever bored a hole up there had treated the shale as the bottom of the world. But a bottom is only a bottom if you stop at it. And the cows would not leave the north draw. I want to tell you what I knew about geology in the spring of 1994, and it is quickly told, because it was almost nothing. I knew that water runs downhill, and that shale is hard, and that clay holds water, and sand lets it go. I was a cattle man, not a well man. But I knew how to watch, because my grandfather had taught me that. And I knew how to be patient, because I'd had no choice in the matter for 58 years. And I knew that the smartest thing in that whole story so far was a cow standing in a dry August pasture, refusing to move. So I did the only thing a man in my position could do, which was to start paying attention on purpose to what I'd been noticing by accident. I went out the next morning before 5, in the dark, with a lantern, and I walked the north draw. The ground was cold, and the frost was silver on the grass, and I got down on my knees in that low fold, and I put my hand flat on the earth, and I pressed. It was soft. Softer than the ridge around it, softer than any drought-hard pasture had a right to be after a dry winter. I dug a little with my knife, just the top few inches, and the soil under the crust was dark, and it held together when I squeezed it, and left a smear of damp on my palm. Anywhere else on Northridge, that same test would have given me dust. I sat back on my heels in the frost, and I looked at the smear of dark on my hand, and I heard my grandfather's voice, plain as the phone in my kitchen the day before, saying, You can't drink the opinion of a man who's never dug. Wad. The loan officer had never dug. The 3 drillers had dug, but they'd all quit at the shale. And my grandfather had asked the question and died before he answered it. The answering, it seemed, had been left to me, and I was 58 and broke, and the sky was still the color of old tin. But for the first time since the phone rang, I felt something other than the cold coming under the door. I felt like a man who'd been handed a map by someone who loved him. Now the trouble with a feeling like that is it doesn't pay for a drilling rig, and I'd already spent $900 boring one dry hole in 1979, and had nothing to show for it but a capped pipe and a lesson. I couldn't just call a rig and say, drill me another hole in the same cursed ground, because the bank now held paper on that ground, and the man who held it had called it worthless. And a worthless farm does not get a loan to prove it isn't. So I did what my grandfather would have done, which is I went slow and I went cheap, and I gathered my evidence before I spent $1 I couldn't get back. I drove into the county seat that Friday to the extension office, because I wanted to know what was under the shale before I bet the farm on it, and I sat across a metal desk from a young agent in a clean tan Carhartt jacket with a clipboard and a way of nodding that told you he'd already made up his mind. I told him about the North Draw and the damp soil and my grandfather's notebook, and he listened polite enough, and then he pulled out a county soil map, a big folded thing with colors on it, and he laid his finger on my 40, and he said this whole ridge is mapped as shallow soils over the Osgood Shale, and the Osgood is what we call an aquiclude, which means water doesn't move through it, which means there's nothing to drill for below it. He said aquiclude the way the loan officer had said dry, like the word was a door closing. He told me the nearest reliable water was the river Alluvium, 2 miles south and 80 feet down, and he told me a new well up on my ground would run somewhere north of $2,000 with no guarantee of anything but another dry hole. And he said all of it kindly, which is the thing about these fellows. They are never cruel. They just close the door gently and go home to supper, and never once wonder what you saw in the dirt. I thanked him for the map. I did not tell him he was wrong because I didn't yet know that he was. And a man who claims he's right before he's dug is no better than the man who claims the place is dry. But I remember driving home along the ridge road with the map on the seat beside me, and I remember thinking that a soil map is drawn by men who walk the surface, and my grandfather had asked about what was below, and no map I ever saw had an answer for a cow. By the following week, the story had gotten around, the way things do. I'd stopped at the diner on the county road Saturday morning for eggs and to trade a few words, and I made the mistake of mentioning to the man on the next stool that I was thinking about water up on Northridge, and by noon the diner had a version of the story, and the version had grown. By the time it came back around to me, through a neighbor's wife, I had supposedly told the extension agent I was going to strike an artesian well on the driest ground in the county, and I was either a genius or gone soft. And the general vote leaned soft. My nearest neighbor to the west drove up to my fence line that Sunday in his truck. And I'll say this about his truck, it was always too clean. A man who washes his truck that often has time on his hands and needs you to know it. And he rolled the window down and rested his arm on the door and looked out over my north pasture with the particular expression of a man enjoying somebody else's foolishness. "What are you doing up here?" he asked me. "Drilling for water, where 3 men already came up dry." And I stood at the fence with my hands in my coat, and I told him plainly, I said, "I'm reading what my grandfather wrote, and I'm watching what my cows do." He chewed on that a second. He said, "Cows don't know where water is." And I said mine wouldn't leave the North Draw in the drought of last August, nor the one before it, and they didn't learn that from the extension office. He laughed. Not unkind, just certain the way certain men laugh. And he said, "Well, you let me know how that pans out." And he rolled the window up and turned that clean truck around and drove off down the ridge road. And I watched the dust settle behind him, and I thought, all right? All right. I will let you know. It took me from March until the middle of May to figure out how I was going to pay for it, And the way I figured it out was the way most real things get done, which is by giving up something I wanted for something I needed. I had a tractor, a good one, newer than anything else on the place, that I'd bought in a fat year. And I sold it to a young fellow 2 townships over for $3,100. And I kept the old one that my grandfather had bought used in 1952 and that still started on the second try if you knew how to ask it. Selling that tractor was the hardest thing I did in the whole business. Harder than the bank, harder than the neighbor's laugh, because a man's tractor is his pride. And I was 58, and I did not know if I was selling it to answer a dead man's question or just to prove a point to a live one. My wife, who is a practical woman and has listened to more of my schemes than any person should have to, sat at the kitchen table the night I told her about the tractor, and she did not interrupt me. She never does. She just let me talk myself all the way out to the end of it, and then she asked me the one question that mattered. She said, "How deep are you willing to let them drill before you call it dry yourself? Because I know you," she said, "and you'll keep them digging till the money's gone, chasing your granddad's ghost." And that was a fair question and a hard one. And I sat with it, and I said the last, well, quit at 55 and hit the shale. If the shale's the bottom, we'll know by 60. If there's water below it, it can't be far below, or the draw wouldn't stay wet. Give me 70 feet. If it's dry at 70, I'll cap it, and I'll believe the bank, and I'll never speak of it again. She nodded at that. She said 70 then and no crying if it's dust. And I said no crying, and I meant it. And that number, 70 feet, became the fence I built around my own foolishness so it couldn't run off with me. The wellman I hired was not the big rotary outfit from the county seat that had cost me so dear in 1979. He was an older fellow, must have been near 70 himself. Ran a cable tool rig off the back of a truck that looked about as old as my grandfather's tractor, and he came recommended by an old man at the farm supply counter, a fellow who'd stood behind that counter for near 40 years and knew every well in 3 counties. When I'd asked that counterman who I ought to call, he'd looked at me a long moment and said, "If you're drilling somewhere everybody says is dry, don't hire the man who agrees with everybody. Hire the one who's curious." And he wrote a name and a number on the back of a feed receipt and slid it across the counter. So I called the curious one, and he drove out to Northridge on a Tuesday morning in the middle of May. And the first thing he did was not look at my ground, it was ask me why. "Why here," he said, "when there's 3 dry holes on this ridge already?" And I did the thing I'd been half afraid to do with anybody. I brought out the notebook, and I showed him the line, "Well, quit at 40. Shale hard, but cows won't leave the north draw in drought. Water below the shale," with the little question mark circled twice. The old well man read it, standing in my kitchen, and he didn't say anything for a while, and then he did a thing I'll never forget. He set the notebook down real gentle on the table, and he looked at me and he said, "Your granddad was asking a good question." Then he said, "Cable tool's slow, but it don't quit at rock the way rotary does. Rotary hits shale and the bit skates and the crew gets tired and calls it cable tool. We can punch through a shale seam if it's thin enough. How thick you figure?" And I said I didn't know. Nobody had ever gone through it. They'd all stopped when they hit it. And he nodded slow, and he said, "Then let's go see," and we walked out to the north draw together in the May morning. And I showed him where the cattle bunched, and he got down on his knees just like I had, an old man in the wet grass, and he pressed his hand flat to the ground and left it there a good minute. And when he stood up, he brushed off his knees, and he said one word. He said, "Here, right here." And that was where we set the rig. I have watched a lot of slow things in my life. I have watched grass grow and calves fatten and a good rain come up over the ridge from the south. And I have watched a man I loved get old and go, and I will tell you that none of it was as slow as watching a cable tool rig make its way down through the ground my whole county called dry. It works by lifting a heavy iron bit on a cable and dropping it over and over, pounding the earth to powder, and then bailing the powder out. and it makes a sound like a great slow heartbeat. Thunk. And the cable sings, and then thunk again. And it goes down inches in a day where the rotary goes down feet in an hour. And I stood out there in that pasture, day after day, in the middle of May, listening to the ground being asked a question, one heartbeat at a time. The old well man kept a log, a little water-stained book of his own, and every few feet he'd pull up a baler of cuttings and rub the wet stuff between his fingers and smell it, and write down what the ground was made of at that depth. And I stood beside him learning to read it. The first 12 feet were the topsoil and the clay, brown and yellow. Nothing you'd drink from. Then a band of gravel, and my heart came up for a second, because gravel can carry water. But it was dry gravel. An old stream bed from before there were men here, long since drained, and we went on through it. And then, at 41 feet, right about where my grandfather's own bit had quit in 1938, the baler came up with gray, hard gray rock powder, and the old man rubbed it and smelled it and said, "There's your shale." And the rig's rhythm changed, the thunk got a harder ring to it, iron on rock, and every foot after that came slower than the one before. 42 feet, 44. The old man never rushed it and never spoke of quitting. 50 feet, 52. My neighbor drove past on the ridge road twice a day in his clean truck and slowed down each time to look, and never stopped. And I knew what he was thinking because it was the same thing everybody thought, that this was the stubborn old fool boring his third dry hole through the county's dry rock. 55 feet, the depth the rotary had quit at in 1979, the depth of my $900 lesson, and the baler still came up gray, and I felt the whole thing waver in me. I had told my wife 70. I had 15 feet left of my own permission. 57, 59, and I stood there in the last light of a long May day, and I thought about capping it and believing the bank, and I looked over at the north draw where the grass was green as anything, and I did not cap it. The morning of the fourth day the old well man was quieter than usual, and I asked him why, and he said, "The cuttings are changing." He held out his palm, and the gray powder in it wasn't quite the same gray. It had a lighter grit to it, and it was, when he rubbed it, damp. Not wet. Damp. He said, "We're near the bottom of the shale seam, I think, and I don't think it's thick." And he didn't say the rest. He was too old and too honest to promise a man water he hadn't found yet. But I saw it in how careful he moved. At 60 feet, the bit changed its song. I heard it before. He said anything, the ring going softer, the iron finding something that gave under it instead of throwing it back. 61. And then, at 62 feet, the old man stopped the rig with a hand on the lever and stood dead still and listened, and I listened, and there was a sound down in that hole that I had never heard in any well I'd ever stood beside. A low seeping trickle, a moving water sound, coming up out of the dark under the shale. He pulled the baler up slow, and it came heavy. And he tipped it out on the ground, and it was not powder. It was mud, wet mud, and standing water pooled in the bottom of the baler. And the old man dipped 2 fingers in it and touched them to his tongue and worked his mouth and said, "Sweet, not a trace of salt." Then he looked at me and he said the second word he'd said to me that mattered. He said, "Substantial." He said, "There's a sand under this shale, full of water, and it's under pressure. Feel how it's rising in the casing already." And he was right. You could watch the water climbing the pipe. The shale had been a lid all those years, a hard gray lid, sitting over a body of good water. And every man who ever drilled Northridge had hit the lid and called the whole place empty when all along 7 feet below where the rotary quit in 1979. 21 feet below where my grandfather's bit stopped and where he wrote his question and then died with it unanswered, there was water. Sweet water. Under the driest ground in the county. Right beneath the fold where the cattle would not leave. We let the well settle and develop for the better part of a week. And when the old man finally tested what it would give, it made 14 gallons a minute and never wavered, which he said was more than enough for the house and the herd, and a good deal besides, more water than the bottomland wells 2 miles south. And it stood at 22 feet below the surface in the casing. 40 feet of water standing in that hole in the ground, the bank had appraised at $400 an acre for the lack of it. I paid the old wellman his money, and it came to just under $3,000 all told, near exactly what the tractor had brought, and I did not begrudge him a dollar of it. And when he was loading his rig to leave, he stood a minute looking at the north draw, and he said, "In 40-some years, I've drilled a lot of wells, and I never once found one because a man's cattle told him where to dig." He said, "Your granddad had good eyes," and then he shook my hand and drove that old truck down the ridge road. And I stood there in June with the pump running and the water climbing into my stock tank, for the first time in the history of that pasture, and I did not feel like a man who'd won anything. I felt like a man who'd finally answered a letter that had been waiting 56 years for a reply. I went into the house, and I got the notebook, and I brought it out to the wellhead, and I opened it to the page, and I read my grandfather's question out loud to the pasture, water below the shale. And I said yes. Just that. There was. And I'm sorry it took us so long. And I want to tell you, I'm not a superstitious man, but the cattle came down into the draw while I stood there, the whole 31 head of them drifting down into that low green fold the way they always had, and they stood around me in the running pump like they'd known the whole time, which of course they had. And I understood then that my grandfather hadn't found the water in 1938, and neither had I in all my years. But the cows had never lost it. They'd been standing over it every August, drawing up through the grass what they couldn't reach with their mouths, and all we ever had to do was believe an animal over a soil map. The bank came around in time. I called the loan officer back that summer, the young one who'd said the word dry so gently, and I told him I'd like a new appraisal, and he asked me what had changed, and I told him there was now a well on Northridge making 14 gallons a minute of sweet water, 62 feet down. The kind of quiet that a young man makes when he realizes the ground he stood on was not as solid as the number he read off a page. The new appraisal came back at $1,100 an acre, near triple the dry number. Because water is the difference between a pasture and a place a family can live, and 40 acres that had been called worthless in March was collateral enough by August that I never worried about that mortgage again. But I'll be honest, the money was the smallest part of it, and if I told you otherwise, my grandfather would sit up in the ground. The neighbor with the clean truck came by in the fall. He didn't call ahead. He drove up to the fence one evening while I was checking the stock tank, and he sat there a minute with his arm on the door looking at the water and the fat cattle around it. And he didn't laugh this time. He said, "That's a good well." And I said it was. And he looked at it a while longer, and then he said, "My granddad always said this ridge was dry." And I said, "Mine wrote it down," and then he asked a question about it, and I showed him where it was. That was as close as that man ever came to saying I'd been right. And it was enough, more than enough, because a small true thing said honest is worth more than a big thing said to flatter you. He nodded, and he put his truck in gear, and before he pulled off, he said, "You ought to have that granddad's notebook framed." And then he drove down the ridge road, and I watched the dust settle just like the first time. Only now, the light was different. I am an old man now, older than that well man was when he found my water, and I have had a lot of years to sit with what happened up on North Ridge in the spring of 1994, and I've come to believe the lesson was never really about the water at all. The water was just how the lesson got made plain enough for a slow man like me to finally see it. What I learned is that this world is full of confident men who will read you a number off a page they never walked, and call your ground dry, and close the door gently, and go home to supper, and never once wonder what a cow knows that they don't. The extension agent was not a liar, and the loan officer was not cruel, and the county was not wrong on purpose. They were just working the surface, the way most of us do, taking the map for the ground and the word for the thing, and stopping at the shale, because everybody stops at the shale. But my grandfather taught me that a bottom is only a bottom if you quit at it. And he taught me you can't drink the opinion of a man who's never dug. And it took me 58 years, and a dead man's notebook, and a herd of cattle that were smarter than every expert in the county to finally understand what the old man had been handing me on the fender of that tractor all those years ago. Attention is its own kind of expertise. The patient thing outlasts the clever thing. And the people we've lost are not as gone as we fear, because they leave things behind, questions and observations and lines of brown pencil waiting in a barn. For whoever is finally still enough to read them, I framed the notebook page. I did, in the end. It hangs in the kitchen where the light from that single bulb falls on it, and some mornings I read it while the coffee heats water below the shale, with the little question mark circled twice. And I think about how long an answer can keep, and how the getting there is the point. If you've got your own piece of ground that somebody called worthless, or an old tool, or an old way, or an old notebook that the fast and certain folks laughed at, I'd truly like to hear about it. So tell me down in the comments, and if this story meant something to you, stay a while and subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we get there. And there's always water under the shale, if a man's just willing to go a little farther than everyone told him to.